Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of this illustrious conference for bringing us together. The title of my presentation is A River of Perpetual Praise, a study of 5 poems across 5 regions in the Bilad al-Sudan. It's an attempt to summarize the tradition of Madih Nabawi poetry across the region called Bilad al-Sudan. So we'll skip this for the sake of time. All right, so Madih poetry, although it plays an incredibly important role in Islamic scholarship in West Africa, in Islamic Muslim everyday life in West Africa, has largely been ignored in Europhone scholarship, and even in the Arabophone scholarship hasn't received as much attention recently. Classically, it's received a lot more, particularly that of West Africa. This is due to a few factors. One is the myth of Islam noir, which my colleague Rudolf West summarized as Arab culture or Persian culture plus Islam just equals Islam, but African culture plus Islam equals some kind of funky syncretism, which is total nonsense. Also, people outside of West Africa assume that within West Africa there's a lack of an Arabic literary tradition, or assume deficiency of this. But I'm speaking to the choir here when you know that we have many, many, many fine scholars of the Arabic language and have had for about a millennium. Also, people tend to see in the Arab world, especially West Africa, as the periphery, not the center when it comes to Arabic literature and learning. But the traditional way to look at things is not via geography, but rather through silsila, through sanad, through isnads. So the communities in West Africa today that are producing and writing poetry or doing fiqh or things like that are no further from the first Muslim community in terms of isnad than the ones in Mecca and Medina. If you look at isnad rather than geography, you'll have a different sense of roots and trunk versus branches. Also, even recently in popular culture, there's a program run from the Emirates out of Abu Dhabi called Emir Shuara, which is a poetry competition, Arabic poetry competition. And every year there are Nigerians and Senegalese who are in the finalists. And in 2019, Oludamini from Senegal won the Arabic poetry competition in Abu Dhabi. So West Africa is very strong and has been very strong in Arabic poetry. Now on the other side, in the Europhone scholarship, when people speak about African literature, they usually mean African literature written in European languages. If you take a class on African literature, you'll read Wole Soyinka, you'll read Chinua Achebe, maybe you'll read Sheikh Hamidou Khan, but you'll read authors who are writing in English and French. You won't read the authors writing in Arabic, even though the vast majority of African literary production has taken place in Arabic and Ajami. Among some scholars, they've assumed because Arabic poetry is difficult, that the only people who can appreciate Arabic poetry are scholarly elites. But if you just step outside the street or you show up here around Mawlid time, you know that's not true. Everybody from beggars to the most elite scholars will appreciate the Borda, will appreciate the Hamziya, will appreciate poems by Sheikh Usman Dan Fodio and others. In fact, the poetic tradition is one of the places where the most elite scholarly levels and the most popular levels coincide. This poetry is also we've had difficulty studying it in the West because of this divide between African studies and Islamic studies. To give you one example, when I was at Harvard University as a graduate student, there was a text published in Senegal in Arabic that I wanted. So I went to the African librarian and I said, can you help me get this book? She said, no, that's Arabic. I don't do Arabic. You have to go to the Middle Eastern librarian. I went to the Middle Eastern librarian. He said, no, that's Africa. I don't do Africa. Right? So the study of Arabic literature and Islamic studies in Africa has kind of fallen in between the cracks of the ways in which the disciplines have been constructed in the West. But despite this neglect, Madih poetry remains by far the most popular form of literary production in Muslim West Africa. Thank you. I'll have to skip this, but the history of Madih Nabawi goes back to the Prophet's companions, particularly Hassan ibn Thabit, Ka'b ibn Zuhair, who wrote the first border poem. But it really took shape and took form in the 6th, 7th century Hijri, in the 12th, 13th century, with poets like Al-Fazazi from Andalusia, whose Ishriniyat is very popular in Nigeria, with Ibn Farid, with Al-Busiri, his famous Hamziya and Borda, probably the most popular poem in the whole world. And this shape that it took combines the old Arabic Qasida tradition praise poetry, things from the Sirah literature, Maghazi literature, Shama'il literature, things from Sufi literature, all into this very beautiful form. So we'll go next slide. Now, the classical structure of the Arabic Qasida has a tripartite structure. So the Arabic Qasida usually begins with a nasib, an amatory prelude in which the poet stops and weeps at the ruins, the atlal of the beloved's campsite. So, on the board, min tadakuri jirani bidi salami mazajta dam anjara min muqlatin bidami. Right, so in the Madih Qasida, the atlal, the ruins of the beloved's campsite, get transformed to Medina and the environs around Medina. And this nasib, it describes a landscape that's at once outer and inner. So when the Burda talks about lightning flashing, it's also expressing the inner state of the poet. The next section of the Qasida traditionally is the Rahil, the journey section. So the poet goes off on a journey, fights battles in pursuit of the beloved, in pursuit of glory. In the Madih Qasida and the Sufi Qasidas, this gets transformed into a spiritual journey of suluk through the different maqams and stations of the spiritual path. In Madih poetry, this is also the section where there's a lot of self-abasement, in which the poet will say, I'm no good, I'm unworthy of even praising the Prophet. Then the closing section is usually the longest in Madih section, in which there's a long section of Madih in which the beloved, the Prophet, is praised. And it usually concludes with a request for intercession or union. And then in the Sufi context, this third section represents or symbolizes the haqiqah, fana, annihilation in the presence of God or the Messenger of Wusul. And like I said, it concludes with du'as for intercession, salvation, a good end, blessings, etc. So this tripartite structure, in some version, you see in most qasidat al-madh, praise poems. Now, the tradition of praise poetry and writing Arabic qasidas is very, very old in this part of the world. It's attested as far back as the 12th century, the 6th century Hijri, with the figure of Abu Ishaq Ibrahim al-Dhakwani al-Kanemi, who visited Marrakesh in 594-1197. He befriended the poet al-Fazazi there, and he wrote some verses that are collected. So, more than 900-year-old tradition of Arabic poetry in this region. Thank you. So the 5 poems I want to briefly go over you can see where they're spread out on the map in manuscript collection. So Al-Yadali Salatu Rabbi is a Mauritanian poem, but it's by a Mauritanian sheikh, but it's widespread throughout West Africa and even North Africa. Usman Danfodio's Daliya, I think I don't have to say anything about that here, everybody knows that. Muhammad al-Majdoub's Allah Ya Rasulullahi, Inni Mughramun, is by a Sudanese sheikh, but it's spread and become even popular in the northeast of Nigeria. Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba's Midadi is popular in Senegal and surrounding areas. And then finally, Sheikh Ibrahim Yas, Hawlahi, his poem Iwana Kisra is pretty much found throughout all of the Bilad al-Sudan and some places in North Africa as well too, where his movement, the Faida Tijaniya, has spread. Next one. Okay, but Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba wrote, he says, whoever approaches the poetry of the saints by grammar and prosody alone will suffer grave mistakes. Right, so we can't just do i'rab on these poems to understand them. You need something more than language. In the words of Goethe, to understand the poet, you have to enter the poet's land. So we'll try to do a very brief tour of this poet's land. So we'll start Muhammad al-Ghadali's Salatu Rabbi. It's kind of regarded as the origin of the tradition. He lived in the 18th century, born in the 17th century. So Western Saharan scholar Shadli Sufi. So the story of Salatu Rabbi that he writes, he was walking one day and he heard Igawan, traditional griots, singing a song in praise of a king. And he liked it so much, he said, I want to write a qasida praising the Messenger of God in this style. So he took the tune and he wrote a qasida to it rhyming in mim. And so it has an atypical meter because the melody was, and the meter of the original poem was from Hassani Arabic. So it has an irregular meter that's not one of the 16 classical meters. It's not a muwashahat. It's okay. No, not yet, sorry. And so he wrote this poem, and then the king, who the original song was about, found out about this, and he heard somebody jacked his praise poem. He wasn't happy about it, so he summoned Al-Yadali to his court and said, what have you done with my poem? He said, I took it and I wrote a poem of someone better than you. And that made the king even more angry, and he commanded Al-Yadali to recite the poem. Yadali recited the poem for him, and he melted into tears and gave him gifts. He was so moved by the power of the poem. There's several other kind of can you go for, yeah, thank you. There are several other miracles attributed to the poem. It saved him from a shipwreck, it healed somebody's camel, other things like that. And Yadali says this is all due to the barakah of the one the poem praises. And he says, composing it in Arabic was easy for me because of the barakah of the one it praises. Now it's written in the form of a muwashahat, which is an Andalusian form, in which you can divide it up different ways, but you can have 4 misras, 4 hemistitches. Each of the first 3 of the same bait will rhyme with each other, and then the last one will have the end qafiyah, the end rhyme. Right, so this one, for example, is ayat tutaha, laysa tubaha, wala tanaha, ala dawam. So you see this. So because of this repeated internal rhyme, it has very catchy, almost hypnotic effect, which I can't play for you now, but maybe later. The poem is focused mainly on the character traits, the appearance, the miracles of the Prophet, and ends with a beautiful section asking for the intercession of the Prophet and expressing the love of the poets. It doesn't follow the classical tripartite structure of the Qasida. It's basically all madih within the request at the end. It was massively influential throughout the region, widely imitated by several other poets in Senegal, Sudan, even as far away as Iraq. Next slide, please. Okay, next, Usman Danfodio's Dalia. Everyone here probably knows more about this poem than I do, but the story is Usman Danfodio wanted to follow his Sheikh Jibril ibn Omar on Hajj when he was 20 lunar years old. But he didn't get his father's permission. His father didn't give him permission. So Jibril ibn Omar sent him back. And he was heartbroken, and he wrote this poem expressing his longing to visit the Prophet in Medina. And it belongs to a genre of qasidas at the time called Hijaziyat, these poems longing for the Hijaz. It starts out famously, هَلْ لِي مَيْسِرٌ نَحْوَ طَيْبَةَ مُسْرِعًا. Says, is there a way for me to travel to Taiba swiftly, Medina swiftly? And he wrote it when he was only 20 years old. He says, I know that I'm no good at praising the best of the world's Muhammad. However, I've been afflicted with his love and I've manifested it. This is not a game for me. I'm not joking. So don't laugh at my poetry, for I know I'm incompetent. Who is there who can perfect the praises of Muhammad? But even though he says he's not a good poet, he has some really beautiful lines here, such as, you who would count the wonders of Muhammad, can you measure the foaming sea? You who would count the sand in its courtyards, the miracles of Muhammad surpass this. An interesting feature.
Thank you, Prof. I want to 1 minute to.
Okay, you want me to conclude? All right. We'll just skip ahead. I won't have to say next one. Thank you. Oh, we skipped. All right, it's okay. We'll skip to the conclusion or the last poem. Sorry, on the right. Other side. No. This way. Yeah, down. Okay. So I'll just briefly say something about this poem by Sheikh Ibrahim Yas, Iwana Kisra, because it has something to do with the political dimensions of this poem. So this was written on a 1960 visit of his to Baghdad, when he went and visited the Iwan of Khusros, this giant arch that was, according to Islamic legend, cracked upon the birth of the Prophet. So he took this as the atlal, for the nasib of his poem. And he connected the cracking of the Iwan of Khusros with the birth of the Prophet with the cracking of colonial oppression. So this was the year 1960, where Nigeria gained its independence, Ghana gained its independence, all of these countries gained their independence, and Sheikh Ibrahim Yas was very influential in these independence movements. It's the same year that he wrote a treatise, Africa for the Africans. Okay, now to the conclusion. Okay, so there's a long, dynamic, and ever-renewed tradition of praising the Prophet in his own language, in Arabic, in the context of Bilad, al-Sudan, fostering intimacy with him. I didn't get to cover this, but Sheikh Ahmadu Bamba said in the one poem that I translated, I began to traverse the path of the Sufis the moment I began to write his praises. So writing poetry in praise of the Prophet wasn't just a literary exercise, it was a spiritual exercise, and it was very central for all of these authors and for many of the spiritual traditions in the Bilad al-Sudan that were focused on a spiritual connection with the Prophet. There's a close mutual influencing tradition between this tradition in Arabic and the Ajami tradition. So the traditions of poetry in Fulfulde, in Hausa, in Wolof, in Yoruba, some of the meters in this tradition in Arabic come from those the meters in those languages, as well as some of the other features, metaphors, etc. There's many people in West African Muslim societies develop what Falun Gong has called a musical derived literacy in Arabic through the recitation of these poems. That is, they learn Arabic, they learn to read Arabic, they learn prosody, they learn vocabulary through the constant repetition of these poems. It's a major source of Arabic literacy. Also, as the kind of most popular form of adab, it shapes people's character individually, it shapes society's collective mores, and it develops leaders politically. All of these people who are poets, one of the ways in which people develop a following is they write a poem in praise of the Prophet that becomes very popular. Almost all great spiritual leaders in West Africa have madih poems in praise of the Prophet that are widely recited by people. This tradition is trans-regional. The poems cut across regions, trans-ethno-linguistic, trans-tariqa. So Tijanis will appreciate Qadiri poems, Qadiris will appreciate Tijani poems, people affiliated with no tariqa will appreciate these madih poems, and it crosses eras. So poems from the 18th century are recited and loved today, and recited alongside contemporary poems. So if we study this tradition seriously, it invites us to consider the Sufi tradition in part as a literary movement, but especially this literary tradition of madih poetry as a spiritual movement. And the spiritual and the literary in this context really can't be separated at all. And one final thing that you see from studying this tradition of madih poetry across eras, across geography, across time, is that tough times usually produce a lot of madih poetry. When there's a lot of conflict, people start praising the Prophet of Rahmah in hopes that his intercession and his rahmah and his presence will help our societies. And given the tough times that we're in now, I think we could all benefit from some madih. Thank you very much.